Right, Kim, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. This is meeting number 5 of the Energy Code Board. Appreciate you guys spending the afternoon with us. And as a reminder, today we are going to be deep diving into the solar ready codes. So let me go ahead and I'll share my screen. Oh, Adam, actually, can you make me a host, please?
Done.
Okay, there we go. Awesome. So here we go. This is our agenda for the day. So we're going to start with the approval of the meeting minutes from last meeting. Then we'll move into a discussion on public engagement. And this is really going to center around the question, how does the board want to approach engagement from the public and feedback from the public on this process as a whole? Then we'll start diving into the solar readiness aspects of today's meeting. And we'll begin by sharing what we found in our cost summary review as it relates to solar readiness costs. We'll go through the state statute language and how the requirements of that, or what's required per state statute, compares to the language and the requirements within the 2021 IECC Solar Ready appendices. And then we'll spend some time going through the residential appendix and the commercial appendix, and including where, as we did in our summary presentation, where different jurisdictions across the state have differed from the appendix within the IECC. And then after all of the solar ready discussion, if there's time, we'll go ahead and provide you guys a high-level overview of the cost summary that we've put together, which will be shared with you guys following this meeting. And I want to remind folks in that chunk of time from 12:45 to 2:30, our goal of today is to hear from you guys all of the pieces of code that you would like included in the state solar ready code. So when we look at the appendices, when we look at the other communities solar ready codes, we are looking for guidance from you on what's going to be in the final code product that we bring back to you guys in a couple of weeks. So keep that in mind. If you guys have questions, if you want to flag anything, if you think I need more information here, or this isn't clear to me here, make sure you're bringing all of that up. This is going to be the best opportunity is going to be in this meeting to discuss any and all aspects of the solar ready code. So just want to really emphasize that today we're trying to get as much out of you guys as we can so we can draft the code and be in good shape for our next solar ready meeting. And with that, I would like to move us along to the approval of the meeting minutes from meeting number 4. Did anybody have any suggested changes to those meeting minutes? If not, does someone want to motion to approve them?
Move to approve.
Thanks, Aaron. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thanks, Carolyn. And I guess then all that approve, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any objections? Okay, meeting minutes are approved. Thank you, guys. Yes, Adam.
Hey, Kim, just before we jump to the public engagement discussion, I just wanted to give a brief update on our vacant seat on the board. Director Tour has made the decision to appoint Rob Buchanan, who's a product manager for new residential construction with Excel Energy, to fill Mary's seat. I think he was going to be a little late to join us today just because he had a previous engagement and he only found out that he was appointed on Friday and was not able to move that engagement. So he will be joining us a little late, but I just wanted to let you all know that Rob will be joining us for the remainder of the board term. And he's really excited to get started. And when he joins us, maybe later, maybe we can give him an opportunity to just briefly introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think that sounds great. We'll keep an eye out for when he joins the meeting. Okay, well, with that, Allie, I'm going to pass it off to you to take us through the public engagement discussion.
Thank you, Kim. So I think this was in part prompted because last meeting, someone listening in on our code board meeting from the public asked in that Q&A section if we would be publishing the draft language that we are deriving from your input here in these next couple meetings. It's like the draft language that we'll be voting on in meetings 9 and 10. And so because beyond keeping these meetings open to the public, any additional public input is sort of cherry on top and would be a board decision to do. And so we would like to put that forward to you guys as a discussion point. And so, Kim, if you could go to the next slide, please. By public input, we mean that it's the process for soliciting comments and integrating feedback from the public. And so currently we solicit public input in two different ways. One is the CEO has an online portal to accept comments and code proposals. And then two, it's these meetings. These meetings are open to the public, and interested folks can and have sat in to listen and make comments and give input or feedback. But we don't really have a process determined by the board to review and respond to public input from the portal, as well as any additional feedback that you might want to gather outside of these meetings. So far, we have received 3 public comments and 1 code proposal through this portal. So definitely seems like we've been getting a little bit more engagement from the public during these meetings. And so given that, we'd like to know how you all want to review and vet these public comments and code proposals from the portal, first off.
And yeah, Carolyn.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're here to advance the public interest as a whole. And so I do think it's important for us to create space to hear from the community. And I do appreciate you raising this, as I do think we should have some defined process whereby at the minimum we're committing to each board member collectively reviewing what we're receiving from the public and discussing any comments or concerns that we heard or saw within that very deliberately before we move to a voting phase. So I do feel that whatever we want to do should happen before we vote specifically on code language. I'm not sure of the feasibility of, for example, creating a space where like people are verbally giving us comment or present in a meeting. I think as we discussed earlier, there was intent to create the portal so that we would have that place to get that feedback and be able to review it. With that in mind, we would probably want to think about deadlines for when we'll receive comments through, and also think about how we create transparency and broadly share with the community when there is something for them to provide comment on. So those would be things I would name. I don't have solutions. I just thought I would offer those up as my preliminary thoughts.
Yeah, Adam.
Just to follow on what Carolyn said about live comment, I just wanted everyone to be aware that I have received a number of requests from members of the public to have essentially a live opportunity to ask questions and have discussion with the board. As Ali said, it'll be up to you to decide whether or not we do that, but just wanted everyone to know that we've been have gotten a couple of requests from the public to do something like that.
Thank you. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. I agree it's important to be able to take public input. With that being said, allowing this to be done live in our meetings with the time frame that we've been assigned to finish our task, I think we'd be getting an extra meeting every week just to go over that. But so with that being said, my suggestion would be to, I know looking at the portal summarizes some of that, but maybe it makes sense for Kim's group to throw an agenda item and provide maybe a short summary of the comment, suggestion, whatever that might be. And then we would have an opportunity, the board would have an opportunity to just discuss that and decide what to do with that one way or the other. If it's proposed code language, we can maybe vote or just agree to move it forward as we come closer. We don't have, with respect, I know that the comments could get quite long unless you go to Robert's Rules of Orders and start doing the 2-minute thing and the 1-minute rebuttal type stuff that I'm used to with the code change. That's just my opinion and suggestion.
Thank you. Carolyn, I think you were next.
Yeah, and I was going to echo what Tim said. I think if we allow for a live comment period, which I think would be acceptable, it would have to be structured, I mean, commensurate with maybe the way we do it as local jurisdictions, with a set amount of time, not necessarily an active dialogue, as I think Adam's gotten some requests for more of a ask questions and engagement kind of thing. I think that needs to be, I think that will be maybe slightly unmanageable, but I do think creating a set time amount and allowing for some public comment that's structured could be okay. So just wanted to offer that.
And just to be clear really quick on Carolyn's point, I was not weighing in on whether or not the board should do that or should not do that, just merely trying to share that was the feedback we had received.
Thank you.
Totally understood, yeah.
Don, yeah.
So my opinion here is I think we should probably consider a public comment, an open public hearing type thing, maybe singularly before a final adoption. I don't think we should do it every meeting. The folks on this board are verbose enough. I don't think we would get anything done if we have more people talking. So.
Point taken. So it sounds like to me there's not a ton, there's some appetite for some kind of engagement with the public, but limited and moderated or facilitated in some way, potentially live. And then I think it makes a lot of sense to have like an agenda item where we cover these proposals or comments that we receive in the online portal. I think that sounds like a good way to move forward on the current existing public engagement process. With that, does the board wish to have additional opportunity for public engagement, knowing that you can have these one-on-one discussions with stakeholders outside of meetings, and you're definitely free to bring those concerns or whatever you hear from stakeholders to these board meetings. But yeah, I think just noting that accepting additional public comments will mean time outside of these meetings potentially to review comments. And then just being able to set the expectations with both the board and the public as to what that will look like. Due to our tight timeline, we don't have a ton of flexibility. Carolyn?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've already accepted the opportunity to provide written comment and made the commitment to review that. So I think we made that decision at an early meeting, and it still stands, and we just need to make sure that we're, as board members, reviewing that. I think that the question in play is whether there should be at least a single opportunity for oral comment. I agree with Don's comment about, I think that would have to be a single experience, not as part of every discussion. And so I did want to name what you commented. I think as we're structured currently, we're envisioned to vote on the individual elements of the code. Not all in one meeting, if I remember right from our structure last time. So I think we would have to restructure that if we were to allow for a public comment period, or at least a final, like we can vote on it and then have one final voting opportunity. We would have to add that in after a public comment. So I will advocate for at least creating space for something like a public hearing where we can accept a couple minutes worth of testimony, because I think when people have the opportunity to provide comment, it at least allows them a space to vet that and provide it to us. In the absence of that, I think it creates a lot more tension around what we're doing and what we're adopting. So I would tend towards advocating that and would offer that as a proposal. And I realize we'd probably maybe have to add an additional meeting prior to our final meeting to do so.
Thanks, Carolyn. I'll just echo, I agree. I think given the tight timeline and the topics we have to cover in each one of our meetings, that would certainly look like an additional meeting for the board.
How do other folks feel about that?
I'm supportive of Carolyn's proposal.
It sounds like a reasonable plan to me.
Yeah, Andrew.
A separate question. In the discussion here, it says that the board may have one-to-one discussions with stakeholders. Who's intended as stakeholders? Is that any party, including a board member?
I think that consideration was just intended to say that you are free to have conversations that outside of these meetings with anyone except the board members, but to sort of be able to you are it's up to your discretion to chat with other folks and identify concerns that you may want to.
And Andrew, maybe we can have council weigh in on this too. David's on the call, I know, but I think the purpose really in saying that was that the board members are only prohibited in private in terms of talking to each other. So you are able to engage with other interested parties outside and bring those perspectives back to meetings without violating any kind of rules. So I think that was the purpose of making that point, is that, you are not prohibited from talking to other people and getting opinions and comments on proposals on your own.
With respect to that, and this may be a different question, but the same type. Many jurisdictions are now adopting amendments to the 21 IRC or IECC. It's my understanding that there is a group, I don't know all parties in this group, that have coordinated with multiple jurisdictions to prepare similar and consistent amendments. I don't know if any board members are part of that group. It would be my desire to speak with persons of that group, including building officials, on their proposed amendments. Whether that's permissible or not is a question. I would believe a stakeholder could be a building official, other than a building official. I mean, a building official on here could be a board member and a stakeholder, but as I read some of these proposed amendments, I personally am not aware of who this group is and who the members of this group is that are operating in concert throughout northern Colorado, and don't know what their purpose and intent, and if any of those persons are already board members.
I mean, I think that there's a number of code cohort efforts that are going on around the state, and Kim and Allie and Claire can definitely speak to that, seeing as they facilitate at least one of them. But yes, there are multiple efforts going on around the state where jurisdictions are essentially meeting together to try to develop consistent code amendments to the base code or additional above code stretch codes. There's more than one effort. There's been several across the state. So I could turn to Kim to at least talk about what's going on in Eagle County.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adam. So Andrew, there have been 2 code cohorts that Lotus has supported in the last year. One is in sort of the Boulder County Northwest metro region of Denver. The other is in Eagle County, Colorado, which is sort of central mountains. We have some representatives from the we're sort of called it the Boulder County cohort on this board. And so as far as reaching out to those folks and engaging with them on the cohort, because they're board members, that would be not permissible, but you'd be welcome to reach out to any one of the other communities, whether it be their building code official or their planning directors or whomever was involved in our process, to hear more about the cohort process and what they did and their, ask them their opinions on these amendments. So does that help? Do you have any follow-up questions on that?
It helps somewhat. I may request, at least in the Boulder and surrounding area, if there are members that are not board members that I may be able to contact, if anybody could separately provide a list of persons that I could, because I had a few questions arise in some of these amendments, and the jurisdiction adopting the amendment was not able to answer the question. And I assume potentially somebody from the group may be able to.
And Andrew, I would also just note too that you're welcome to ask those members during these board meetings as certain provisions come up that you like align with, provisions that are being discussed by the entire board. You're
Yes.
also, even though you can't contact them outside of meetings, you're welcome to ask them during meetings.
Under the assumption that there may be some intent and commonality, and that's an assumption, I've highlighted portions that under some premise that they arise in some discussion, I do intend on raising them with the board as they come up if there's a similar provision.
And Adam, just to comment as one of the board members who was part of that previous cohort, along with Ron and Tim, and probably others that I'm missing. I just wanted to name that we did complete our cohort work prior to the convening of the Energy Code Board, and it's certainly something that we've all remained very cognizant of now as we look towards the future, to make sure that we are not having those discussions now as a group. So since it came up, I just wanted to make sure that we'd had that very active conversation, I think during one of our earlier Energy Code Board meetings, because we recognized that was one of the areas of potential concern. So just speaking for myself, we've been very thoughtful about that going forward.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, Jason.
Just circling back on the question about getting public comment. Here in Crested Butte, we'll have a public comment period, and people can say what they want, and then it's up to us if we want to respond. And I'm thinking about an alternative for what was proposed by Carolyn. Instead of having an entire hour or two session, right? As we have a draft and we're about to vote on it, would it be appropriate to have the public comment that you guys shared in a Google Doc, everybody reads those, and then during our, maybe a 10-minute agenda item where we acknowledge that we got that comment, and then we choose to respond or not, but kind of keep it tight and like as it progresses, as opposed to all at once at the end. Just a question. I'm not sure what would be the best way to do it, and acknowledging the intent of allowing the public to engage, but yeah, what do you guys think?
I certainly agree with that for the written. I think the question on the table is whether we want to create a space for more of an oral comment period. And I'm intimately familiar with what you described as well, Jason, with the public comment. It's just the question of whether we should create that space for people who maybe don't want to provide it in written format, but want to spend 2 minutes sharing their thoughts with us.
And Adam, is your feeling that the public wants to be able to make a comment live publicly, oral as opposed to written?
Yeah, I think there are differing feelings. I think some are more engaged. I think the reason why some are more interested perhaps in live comment is just so that they can actually dialogue with you about their comment instead of just providing a comment and then listening to it being discussed, that there would be more of that active back and forth. But I don't think that that's necessarily precluded. Like, I don't think that, that could work either way, whether or not you do a single session where it's longer, like you add essentially an extra board meeting that's all intended to be public comment. And you just had that discussion versus trying to do it like in segments during each meeting, right? I think that perspective is satisfied regardless of which of those two you pursue. I think the only thing that these members would, the folks that have reached out to me would probably prefer is that kind of conversation would occur before any final votes, of course, on code elements, so that they could have their opinions heard and have that discussion before any final decisions are made.
Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, and I think the point's been made of the timing of what Adam, how you just put that is the dialogue, and then the person has the opportunity to respond back, and then it gets into a lengthy dialogue. And if there was some time, very specific time limit, but since we're not under Robert's Rules of Orders, if we set something up where it was very specific, that might be the way to go. But we don't have a lot of time. I'd still say, like I started earlier, we'd be setting up another few meetings, and I don't know if few is 1 to 5. My wife always asks me that. What does that mean? But more meetings to get through that would just be. I'm concerned about that timing.
Thank you. Yeah, Director Tour.
I wanted to agree with Tim. I do think that it makes sense to have one public hearing after there's we have proposed language out and before we vote on it, to allow people to speak in person or virtually on this. But I would not structure it as a dialogue. I would structure it more like other boards typically structure it, where people have 3 minutes to make their comments, and where there is not an expectation that every comment is going to be responded to by the board.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we've heard a number of options now, and we're coming up on time for this agenda item. Does someone want to make a motion as to how we should proceed? Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, I'd like to, excuse me, make a motion to set up a standalone meeting towards the end of the process, before we're ready to, after we've got code language, the draft code language in place, to listen to public input and then be able to discuss that, and then move forward with the final discussion amongst the board after that public input closes.
Thanks, Tim. And I do want to add that we will review with you all the submitted comments and proposals from the online portal during each meeting. And so this would just be to satisfy that desire from folks that talked to Adam about hearing like live, giving live comment. Do we have someone to second that?
I'll go ahead and second it.
Thanks, Carolyn. Can we get a vote all in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Cool. Thank you so much.
Anyone opposed?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. All right, so hearing none so far, we can move on. And just noting that given this change, we may need to structure some of restructure some of our meetings to accommodate this extra meeting.
we will take this input, and I just want to make sure before we move on, I have one clarifying question. Is the board interested in hearing and discussing the code language and maybe taking a preliminary vote first ahead of public comment and then discussing any potential change ahead of like a final vote? Or is there an order of operations that someone would like to suggest just to help us with our, crafting our meeting schedule out? Tim, Carolyn, Tim, go for it.
Yeah, actually, I think it might be helpful to do that preliminary. Didn't think of it that way. Just to see what a draft kind of moving forward. And then my question to that comment would be, would that proposed vote and draft language be available to the public, which might help drop off some of the comments or end up adding some more comments?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. The draft language would be accessible via these meetings, absolutely. But we would also, if the board was interested, we could put together that draft code language package after the preliminary vote to get it out to the public so that they could see it. If that would, I'm seeing some head nods. So if that's what you guys would like to see, we're happy to accommodate that.
I think that would be most helpful so that we're not getting comments on what could potentially be considered, and rather we're getting comments on what is being considered.
Yeah, and I think the Energy Office would be happy to provide, on our website where we include all the other materials for the board, we'd be happy to make a place for those materials when they are ready for public sharing, to put that on our website for review.
I support that idea as well. I think it lessens the opportunity for group editing of code items. If there's specific language to which we can all respond or take exception with or offer edits.
Awesome. Okay, so thanks for that input. We will kind of rework our syllabus to make sure we can fit this in, and you'll likely be hearing from us to find a time to schedule that oral input. And it also might mean that there's a potentially more than one meeting where we have the oral meeting where we hear the public feedback, and then one final meeting with the board to discuss it all. So just keep that in mind. We'll see if we can't fit it into what we have, but if not, we'll keep you guys posted as we think through what that schedule looks like. So thank you.
Thanks, Kim. All right, moving on then. So we just wanted to share with you the initial cost analysis that we did per the board's request for now, just so we can get into our discussion of the Solar Ready appendix and code. We'll cover the Solar Ready costs that we found quickly. There were only a few studies on the cost of Solar Ready, so hopefully this is a shorter one. So first off, we had the New Buildings Institute study on their own building decarbonization code, which required that single-family homes be provided with solar-ready equipment, which is as described here in this table, space for a dual pole breaker in the main panel with the conduit and the junction box. And so that was calculated to be approximately 4 cents per square foot, assuming, I don't remember what the assumed home size was. But they basically took these cost estimates from a few different data sources, including RS means, some past project data that they worked on, city cost indices, and then some estimates from local and national vendors. They were working in climate zone 5, so not exactly what we are here. But they also did estimates for infrastructure using some standard engineering methods, and different equipment costs were calculated on a per item basis. They included labor costs at $130 an hour for the mechanical, plumbing, and construction labor rate. And so, yeah, all of that was calculated for a number of different code elements. And this was the one that they pulled out for their Solar Ready. And the next one we took from a code proposal submitted for the IECC 2021 update cycle, which summarized a couple studies in which they found that for homeowners, like basically trying to identify what homeowners could save through solar readiness as opposed to the full retrofit afterwards. And so they took some data from an MBI study and an NREL study and found that homeowners could save a little over $4,000 by doing solar readiness. This was a challenge. We actually weren't able to locate the actual NREL study to identify what their assumptions were. And we took the code, the proposal itself, which didn't include that information. Kim, I think you reviewed that NBI study. Could you speak to Caroline's question? I think it did include the conduit, but I'm not.
Carolyn, yeah, it included conduit, but I don't believe it included a conductor or wiring within the conduit to be run. So it was just the raceway, the empty raceway.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And just noting, thanks, Kim, for throwing in the assumptions on the single family home for this NBI study in the chat.
Awesome. Any other questions on this cost data?
Yeah, Andrew. Sorry.
On this cost study or any other cost study, I'd strongly prefer to see the itemization of the items that make up the cost versus just an aggregated cost.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. We will be sharing the actual report that we pulled together for these. But for now, we just wanted to review with you sort of that aggregate to inform our discussion in just a sec.
And Andrew, just to add to that, you know, our charge from the board was to summarize the cost studies that we had and present the data back to you guys. There are some cases where we were able to get that line item detail of like this wire costs this much. We see that a lot more for the electric readiness provisions. There were for these studies, specifically for solar ready, that line item detail, what we're presenting right now was as detailed as it got. And so we don't have, just based on the summary that we pulled from the data that we had, in some cases that was available, in other cases it wasn't available. So for EV ready and electric ready, we have a lot better granularity to the data, but with solar ready, we didn't really see that breakdown available in the studies we looked at.
This is Andrew. I say that in part for one illustration. Existing homes operate under a different building code than new homes. New homes addresses the structural load of solar panels in different climate zones differently based upon the ground snow load. And they all have cost impacts, and plus certain portions of the metro area are in higher wind zones, which have a substantially incrementally higher cost impact. I didn't know if anybody out there has attempted to address the cost of some of that as to how it gets looked at. And we're not there yet in the draft language. Those were just things that I was anticipating one of these studies maybe had as we go forward. Be able to use a cost study as somewhat of a checklist. Have we addressed similar items and components and measures and things that need to be looked at and explored?
I'll just say from the review that we did, I didn't see any of that type of data broken out, Andrew. But Adam, I didn't know if your hand went up in response to Andrew. If so, go for it. And then I'd like to pass it over to Kristen and then Carolyn.
Yeah. I was just going to say too, perhaps we could also reach out to MBI to see if they have the line by line data that contributed to these summaries, seeing as we know many people at MBI. So I think we could at least ask them if they have that as something that's shareable with us, and then that would at least provide the data if they have it to share, and if not, then we have what we have. But just something as a thought that we could reach out to them about that.
Thanks, Adam. Kristen.
Did you come across any data on later cost to convert if steps weren't taken at the outset?
The only data that we came across for solar readiness is what you're seeing on the screen here, and that was from a referenced NREL report that we weren't actually able to find. It was referenced in the code proposal, and the details of the report that were being referenced were included in the proposal. The actual link and reference to the report was not included, so we can keep digging and see if we can find it. But the information here, the NREL report was provided looking at this is the sort of cost to retrofit in the future.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Kristen, or I mean, sorry, that was Kristen. Carolyn.
Yeah, so a few answers. I think within the NREL report, and I have not read this one specifically, but as I look at the cost, they're clearly having to ballast the roof. It's more than what you would expect just in terms of the conduit and electrical, the additional breaker in the panel. So I think this is representative of a deeper modification for the purposes of a retrofit, but I think it's illustrative of the point Andrew made around the wind loading and snow loading components. And then to answer Andrew's question, no, I don't believe in any of the solar ready studies that I've seen that they've explicitly addressed that impact of roof integrity and foot pound loading on the roof associated, and tried to vary it across different climate zones. So I don't think we'll find that explicit report, but I do agree with you that those requirements will come when the solar system's actually installed. And so I think our charge is really around the kind of standardized loading component, and then they'll have to provide added ballasting. And I think we, if they're in a boulder zone where we require higher wind loadings, they'll have to address that in terms of the installed cost side of the solar, as opposed to something I think we can envision from a base code requirement, but just wanted to offer that.
Yeah, anecdotally, I had that exact same experience where, we built Net Zero in Fraser, Colorado, which has just about the highest wind and snow load requirements that you can get. And the added weight of the solar was absolutely nothing compared to what we already had to build to for snow loads even.
Thanks for that, Kristen. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, my comment, Andrew, that was a good question, I think. But our charge with this legislation, the way I understand it, is doing the solar ready residential part just on new construction. So with that being said, your couple of examples would actually end up making it even look better to do this in the beginning, because of the potential of the cost of the retrofit could go up higher, won't go lower typically. But if you have like different wind based on the newer codes versus older code or the snow load. So, and I'm not sure if it's really worth it, in my opinion, to even try to get update or more info on the cost of the retrofit, because it's going to go the opposite way and be able to make the case for what the legislation is trying to do. Is my comment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. Any last questions before we move on? Hearing none, we'll be sure to share. Yeah, Kim, I see you.
No, I was just getting ready.
Yeah, we'll be sure to share with you the full cost analysis once we're done here. But just wanted to preempt some of the conversation, hopefully with the actual code elements.
Awesome. Thank you, Allie. So to start our deep dive into the solar ready language, we wanted to start with looking at the required elements of the solar ready language that were given to us from the state statute. And so within the definition that was provided in House Bill 22-1362, solar ready means the following things. And we've highlighted in orange the separate components that we see from this definition must be included in our solar ready code language. So solar ready means adequate panel capacity, dedicated electrical panel space, electrical conduit, physical roof space, and structural load to accommodate future installation of solar panels with exemptions for small roofs and consistently shaded roofs. Yeah, Adam.
All right, just before we got started on talking about the actual code elements, in particular those things that were required by statute, I just wanted to remind everybody that we do have our AG counsel, David Banis, on the call with us. So if anyone has questions about what is required by statute and what kind of flexibility the statute provides the board in terms of determining specific details, do feel free to ask him questions as well.
Thanks, Adam. And if I could just take 5 seconds and say, I'd much rather answer questions as we go along and create a good code rather than Adam and me the day before this is due review tons and tons and tons of language for questions that folks have. So please do ask questions as we're building this thing. Thanks.
Thanks, David. And yeah,
A
Carolyn.
quick question on this one. This was the broad across both. It didn't distinguish between residential and commercial, correct? Just so I can track correctly. Thank you.
That is correct. Yes. Okay. So again, we have these, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements that must be included in the Solar Ready code language. And for those of you, as many of you are familiar with the 2021 IECC language, you'll know that there are other pieces that appendix or the appendices require that fall outside of these 6 buckets. And before we go any further, I actually wanted to make sure that for reference, everybody has the code language in front of them. So I'm about to hit send on 2 links, the Solar Ready appendix, the digital version that you can find online for commercial and residential, or if you'd rather, please follow along in the PDF that we sent out with the agenda. That's called Colorado Jurisdiction Solar Ready Codes, that has the appendix language as well as any municipal or county specific language that was included. So just make sure you guys have those resources up. So in case I don't have the language on my slide, you can go back to reference them. Okay, so we have here the 6 sections that were included within state statute, and we just wanted to call attention to where those exist within the Solar Ready appendix. These things are addressed already in written code language through the appendix, and the board has the discretion and decision-making power to say, we like the language in the appendix, we want to change that language, but these items are the minimum requirement. So for adequate panel capacity and dedicated electric panel space, this is referenced in the IECC appendix RB 103.9 called electrical service reserved space. And this only requires reserved panel space, not a minimum capacity. So just to note that there is a small change or it's partially covered, I guess. For the electrical conduit piece, this is partially covered, we think, in the interconnection pathway 103.8, but to note that this only requires the pathway on the drawings. It does not actually state that the conduit must be installed. Moving to the physical roof space, this is required per section 103.1 and section 103.3 that define the solar ready zones and making sure that there's the minimum roof space for it. As far as structural load, this is required per section 103.7, which says you must indicate on your construction drawings that the roof can handle the load. And then number 6, the exemptions. Small roofs, shaded roofs are covered in the exemptions. Small roofs are technically covered in the language of the Solar Ready appendix as a whole, because it says you have to have if you don't have the Solar Ready zone minimum size available on your roof, you don't have to apply with the appendix. So it's kind of baked in, but it's not explicitly written. Any questions on this before we continue to go through the commercial stuff? Everyone following? Okay, awesome. So one more quick note on the residential. So what we've tried to do today, because we're going to be deep diving and there's going to be a lot of stuff to track. We have a charge that we need to set the Solar Ready standard that minimally includes all of those 6 elements. As I mentioned, the Solar Ready Appendix includes things that go above and beyond that, as do other Colorado jurisdictions. And so when we're looking at the appendix language, what we've done is try to highlight those elements that are not required by state statute, but could be considered by the board with this little lightning bolt mark. If you see this, it means it would be not a must have, but maybe a nice to have if the board wants it. Okay. So to look at the things within the appendix that are not named in statute, these are some of the things that we'll go through. So roof orientation, exceptions for buildings with existing renewable energy systems, requirements around construction documentation, requirements around obstructions to the solar ready zone, a capped roof penetration requirement, and then the construction documentation certificate. So none of these are called out in state statute. They are included in the appendix, so they can be included if the board would like them to be. And now we'll just, almost knocked over my water. Now we'll look at those same pieces for commercial. And this is very similar. Commercial has a couple of different elements that aren't included in the residential appendix. But to look at the state statute and where it's covered in the commercial solar ready appendix, we have adequate panel capacity and dedicated electric panel space that are covered by 103.8. We have the electrical conduit that's partially covered by 103.6, that interconnection pathway requirement. The physical roof space is covered by 103.1 and 103.3. Structural load covered by 103.5. And then the exemptions, again, shaded roofs are covered and small roofs are kind of baked into the requirement by way of that solar ready zone. So very similar to residential. And then again, looking at those pieces. Oh, sure, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. Could you go back to the slide you just had up, please? So in that table, I guess I'm a little confused. So you have on the right side, the commercial solar ready appendix for the top 3 boxes, but then you're listing the bottom 3 out of the RB or the residential. So you might have said this and I just missed it, but you were just pointing out maybe in the commercial appendix, those last 3 items are not listed in that appendix, or maybe I missed that. I'm sorry.
No, I'm so sorry, Tim. Thank you for catching that. That is just a typo on my end. That is supposed to read CB for each one of those. These are references to the commercial appendix. So I apologize. We will fix that before we send out the meeting materials to the board and to the public and get them posted. And again, the typos kind of made it through to this part. Apologies, guys. I should have triple checked this. So on the commercial elements, again, these should all read CB. We will make that update. These are the pieces within the commercial solar ready code that are not required by state statute. So the applicable buildings that the solar ready appendix applies to, exceptions for buildings with renewable energy systems, the section on construction documentation, the section on obstructions and shading, and then the energy storage ready area is a big one. So this is included in the commercial solar ready appendix that you have to be energy storage ready. It's not required by statute, so that could be something the board chooses to include or not to include. And then that final requirement around construction documentation certificates. So with all of that, we are going to dive into the residential solar ready appendix, and we're going to go through section by section. So we'll look at the first couple of sections first. We'll share 1 or 2 sections. We'll share the explicit code language. We'll share next which communities have changed those sections if they have. And then I'm going to pause after each section for discussion. And what I'd like to get out of this group again is, do we want to include, like, what do we like or not like the appendix language? Do we like or not like any of the amendments that were made? And we are going to go through sections that aren't explicitly required by state statute. So the discussion point during those slides will be, do we want to include these additional requirements or do we want to keep it to just the state statute law? So we'll start the solar ready zone. This is just roof sections or building overhang designated and reserved for future PV or thermal system installation. Okay, so again, a reminder, these little things indicate that these pieces are not required by state statute, but could be included in the final code language if the board so chooses. So starting with the RB, section 103.1 general. I guess I'll just read the language and then we'll open up for discussion. New detached 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses with not less than 600 square feet of roof area oriented between 110 degrees and 270 degrees of true north shall comply with sections 103.2 and 103.8, with the exception for a permanently installed PV system or where there is shading. And then section 103.2 is that construction documents must indicate the solar ready zone. The other thing I wanted to note is that within, and I apologize, I didn't say this earlier, the bolded text within these are also pieces that we feel could be customized by the board if they so chose. Okay, so this is what these first 2 sections, this is exactly how they read. And here are the very slight small changes that we've seen to these sections within other adopted code language across the state. Boulder changed the language from roof space to explicitly call out the solar ready zone must be shaded. And Denver adds a reference to their specific residential code and adds the requirement for low slope roofs also be solar ready. So again, I'm going to pause here and maybe I'll flip back to this slide, but let me know if anyone wants to go forward and I'll just open it up to the board and let you guys discuss what you like and don't like about these different elements, and with the goal that our team at the end of this discussion will have what we need to draft our first round of code language. Tim, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. So two questions. My assumption would be that 600 square foot, the not less than 600 square foot would apply to each of an individual dwelling unit. So in other words, if you had I still call them duplexes, I think the marketing term shared homes now, paired homes even, I keep getting yelled at by the duplex builders, but per unit or in a townhome where you have 3 or more units, that 600 square foot would just apply to above that individual dwelling unit. Is that correct? Would that be the assessment?
Let me just make sure I understand your question correctly. So you're asking if that 600 square foot roof area is spread amongst the townhomes or is just centered on one?
The intent would be, and this would be in the appendix if it was adopted, or if it makes it into our state code, that 600 square foot area would be applied only to above the individual dwelling unit, whether it be we know a single family, but if it's a paired home or a multiple. So if you have 6 townhomes, each individual townhome roof would have to have the 600 square feet, I believe is what that intent of the language is.
I believe that's correct. And I see Carolyn nodding. I'll let others who've worked with this code, if you have a different thought, please share.
And I was going to flag, there's a provision around the 3 or more story townhomes that reduces the requirement. And I saw that within, let me remember whose it's in, but there was some consideration for, it's in Denver's, that I wanted to flag as also a difference, where they were envisioning the taller, narrower orientations. And I don't think you had that in your table, or you did, but I think they reduced it to 150 square feet in that case. So just wanted to flag that difference.
Okay. So, well, that's how I would read that code. And the reason I bring that up is if the board chooses to move forward to bring in the language in the appendix as written, that we would want to somehow clarify that with a little bit of additional language. And then my second question, for jurisdictions that have adopted the appendix or the appendix, or a modification where it talks about I guess the next slide, which talks about, if you could go, where it's shaded for more than 70% of daylight hours. I'm curious how people prove that. I don't know if we need to go into the details, in this to keep the meeting going, but that would just be a question of, if I had adopted this, I don't know how. So I'd be asking a question of, how do you do that in winter and summer months, et cetera, or is it an average?
Thanks, Tim. Those are fantastic questions. And I will just remind folks that the solar ready zone is going to be further defined in this section 103.3 that we'll get to in a moment, which does break down to your first question, Tim, how the solar ready zone should be treated with townhomes and the size and sort of shape of that solar ready area. So we are getting to that one in just one moment. Chris, I'll pass it to you because you've had your hand up.
Oh, thanks. And so these are some high level comments. I'm not sure if it's what you're looking for. But I'll start by saying I like the idea of us considering the Denver amendment with just lower slope angle roofs, just because it seems to be that a lot of the trend in buildings around the state are lower angle roofs these days. Also, going back to the first slide, do you mind popping back real quick? I'd be curious just to have some discussion, about the thinking on permanently installed on-site renewable energy systems and whether any kind of like thresholds were contemplated. I think for us, we might want to, if we want to integrate this, we might want to consider like what we think is in line, with the language and legislation in terms of anticipating, how much of a building might be able to, produce its energy on site. And then lastly, I do like the idea of including construction documentation requirements. It just seems like if we have it, if it needs to be proven to be code compliant, why not make it easy for building owners to figure out where their solar ready zone is if and when they want to move forward with that.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Carolyn, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, so I'm going to echo Chris's recommendations. I do think the construction documentation is important for later modification to make sure the zone continues to be acknowledged. And then I was also going to advocate for not specifying these requirements where the solar is already being installed at the time. I think it's less concerning to ensure the solar zone is exactly right for when the building's already being constructed with the solar on site. So that's one of the exceptions we've adopted. And then to answer, I think the question, that's annualized calculation on the shading, the 70% of daylight shading hours. So they would have to do a calculation showing the shading areas and using something like a PV Watts or others type tool to do that. It's something that particularly in areas where you have infill or scrapes and rebuilds, it's not really appropriate to push them into making a solar zone if it indeed is not suitable for solar. So just recognizing that as we try and mitigate future costs or stranded costs, if the home is going to be substantially shaded, then imposing these requirements wouldn't be appropriate. And then I also liked the Denver provision of addressing the lower sloped roofs.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. Elizabeth.
Hey, everybody. I have maybe a question and potentially a suggestion, but I want to ask the other code experts on the call. I've always struggled a little bit with this first exception here where it says new residential buildings with a permanently installed blah, blah, blah. The way that the code defines building is not the same way as the code defines dwelling unit. So the way that this is written, you could potentially have, say you've got a row of a sixplex of townhomes. You could put a solar system on the first townhome and then not have to do anything for the rest of the townhomes and, kind of leave those remaining owners a little screwed. It seems like a loophole to me. If we were to address this exception, I would look at it as new residential dwellings or dwelling units rather than buildings.
Yeah, thanks for calling attention to that, Elizabeth. Kristen, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. I wanted to inquire as to what constituted a low slope roof. Does it match like the 212 guidelines found in other construction documents? And also on the shading analysis question, going back to that, there are on-site tools to do that. There's a plethora now of online tools that can do shading analysis. I'm curious for those who have exempted shaded roofs, like, do they allow any kind of shading analysis or does it have to be a specific type?
Yeah, we allow qualified somebody who's willing to sign it, say that they did the analysis.
I did throw in the chat a reference standard from ICC that gives a definition for low slope roof. It's less than 2 to 12.
Thanks for the 212 clarification.
And just to be clear, Denver also specifically defined that to be the same.
I did not know that off the top of my head, I assure you.
Thanks, Kevin. Andrew.
Couple of questions. Tim raised a good one on paired homes. Some paired homes may have a total roof area of around 1,000 square feet. I'm not sure many builders of paired homes can ensure there's 600 feet within that orientation with absolute certainty. And I know that in the commercial, there's an exception that permits smaller areas. Is there an ability to increase the number of exceptions to include roofs that may not otherwise wholly comply because there is not adequate roof space for one reason or another, and how code language may be drafted to address that is a question. A second question is, many builders may be finished lot buyers of land and therefore be building on land that cannot control the orientation of the home and may not, in many instances, be able to ensure that 600 square feet can in every instance be achieved in that orientation based upon decisions that were made and decisions that were approved by the very jurisdictions in which they operate. So how do the zoning folks and the building folks coexist when it comes to provisions that are prescriptive in nature, such as this? There must be certain exceptions when it comes to zoning that mandated a certain home style and roof style and certain monotony, and therefore can't be deemed a code violation by virtue of decisions that the jurisdiction already made.
Andrew, just to your first question, and I'll let the board share their thoughts on your other questions. Within the definition of a solar ready zone area, it does, and hopefully you can see the slide, it does specify the how to deal with the multi-unit townhomes. And I think my interpretation, and others, if they disagree, please share. But my interpretation of this appendix is that if you don't have a solar ready zone on your home, you're not beholden to these requirements. So if this minimum space piece can't be met, then the conduit and the panel space and all of those pieces don't have to, this appendix does not apply to you. And Elizabeth, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that if you go back to RB 103.1, it says if you don't have 600 feet of roof area that fits this, you don't have to do any of it. So Andrew, I think that's your exception. It's actually more generous.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And then did you have another? Oh, sorry, Andrew.
That would be if any roof does not have at least 600 square feet of solar ready area. Is that how?
Yeah, at least 600 square feet oriented between 110 and 270. Like only if you have that do you then
Like
have to
east,
follow
west, or
the
south.
rest. Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't say thou shalt design your roof to do this. It's just an if. So I think that's meeting the intent you're looking for that exception.
Now, because the appendix to the IRC or IECC does not specifically state that in the manner that you stated, would it not be preferable to include that in the intent or somewhere?
Personally, I think it would be redundant. I would read RB 103.1 if I don't have 600 square feet of roof area in that orientation, I would stop reading because I don't have to follow the rest of it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Great questions, Andrew. Kim, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for all of your input. I have a question for those that have this code or a version of it adopted. Are there any instances where architects or builders are designing their roofs such that then creates them to be exempt from the requirement? It seems to me like that would be a minor enough thing that people aren't making that their number one design criteria, but I'm just curious if anybody's run into that before.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
I can only comment on what Denver has seen with the green buildings ordinance, which of course started as a green roof ordinance. And there was lots of questions about whether people would game the system about the definitions of available roof area, because roof areas over a certain slope did not have to meet the requirement. And there really wasn't any. There was no gaming of the system. It's not that you couldn't potentially game the system, but it just wasn't worth it and wasn't something that people attempted. So I personally wouldn't be super worried about it, although you technically could.
Okay, thank you. That was my thought, but I just wanted to check. Thank you.
Yeah.
Andrew.
Yes, a follow-up question with respect to the solar ready zone. As it goes on into RB 103.3, which I assume we'll get to the next slide, that we've already spoke briefly about the 3-story or less townhomes. So for any paired home, the paired home would fall under the 103.1 with the 600 feet. There would be no townhome-like application to a paired home. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Carolyn, did you raise your hand in response to that?
Yeah, I think they still generally get treated as individual units within the code, whether they're 2 or 3 or 4 units. Tim, do you have something to weigh in on that too? I mean, you see these come through, but we call those, we tend to call them duplexes or townhomes, not a paired home. Like paired home doesn't show up in as a definition in code. It's either a duplex or a townhouse.
Yeah, that's kind of, I understand Andrew's question when I made that comment a little earlier, that if the board chose to bring in this language, my recommendation would be to clarify that 103.1 and say if we could go to that language, please, where it says new detached 1 and 2 family dwellings and then townhouses. But to clarify that the 2-family dwelling as permitted under the IRC, the 600 square foot of roof area would apply to the individual dwelling unit of those two. And then when you go into the townhouses, it has 103.3 that even goes into a little more depth with the more like an exception. And then in there, I think we should clarify, if you could go to that slide, please. There where it says with a total floor area less than or equal to 2,000 square feet per dwelling, I think clarification would need to be made there to, well, I guess we need to figure out, does that mean a 2,000 square foot total, including the garage, or just the habitable space? Because we typically, our townhomes that we see, whether they're 2-story or 3-story units, they have the garage, two-car garage. And so there's a certain square footage. So it would just, I think, warrants some clarification for that 2,000 square foot rule.
Great point.
Usually referring to conditioned floor space, correct? Nor in most cases, but maybe it would be beneficial to clarify by putting the word conditioned in front of that.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I agree. I was just going to totally agree there, because you could also have a conditioned garage. So if your garage is heated, I would want it to be included in that 2,000 square feet, because that's extra energy use and all that. And if it's not, I agree, it could be excluded. So it would be great to just add that clarification in here.
Okay, noted. Great. Any other final notes or thoughts on these first two sections? We've kind of moved ourselves into the 103.3 section, so I'm happy to continue, but just want to check and make sure we're feeling good here before I continue on. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think we're saying a lot of the same things, and I just want to clarify, because I've always struggled with the mixed language here between dwelling units and buildings, that we clarify all of this language that is, if our intent is truly, per single family home, per side of the duplex, per townhome, that we specify dwelling unit instead of all of this, everywhere that it says building, because those are conflicting.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. And Andrew.
A follow-up question on the zone area. So under RB 103.2, it states the construction document shall indicate the solar ready zone. That also comes back up under RB 103.10, and to me is redundant. But if a home is exempt because it does not have at least 600 square feet oriented within that, is that itself a certain requirement of a construction document, or is that a certain requirement of what to a prospective buyer?
I think that's a great question. Does anybody who's worked within this have any thoughts to share?
Can you restate it, because I didn't quite follow the question?
If a home cannot satisfy RB 103.2, does 103.2 and 103.10 is there any obligation to do anything? Or is there any separate obligation not in a code yet that requires a disclosure that there is no solar ready zone permissible on this home that satisfies the code?
Elizabeth?
Yes, if you read this explicitly, and again, we're just considering it, if you do not meet the 600 square feet per 103.1, you do not have to do 103.2 through 8, but there is a 103.9 and a 103.10, and you would have to do those. So 103.9 is the electrical service reserved space. So, you have to save for future solar electric on there. And then the 103.10 is a permanent certificate. So that still requires that you note the electrical service reserve space. But obviously, if there is no solar ready zone, you would not have to note a solar ready zone. So you can have 103.1 and 9 and 10 without 2 through 8.
Is that something that should be fixed? That seems like a flaw.
That's probably a question for the committee. It is intentional, but it's a good question.
Can you clarify why you believe it to be a flaw?
What purpose does it serve to reserve a space if there is no zone? What purpose does it serve to have an obligation to provide a construction documentation that indicates the zone and other requirements when there is no zone?
So it's just the electrical service capacity, not the construction documentation. So if there's no zone, anything associated with the zone goes away. But you still have to create space for the future addition of the solar and the electrical service panel.
Yeah, and I personally still think that has value. If I'm a homeowner and maybe my roof didn't meet the solar ready requirements and my contractor didn't have to do it, but I might decide I want to do it anyways. And so that would still allow me to do it and know that there's electrical capacity for me to do so. But the size, when the IUCC did all their calculations and whatnot, the size exceeds the current cost effectiveness of the energy benefit versus the original cost. So that's why it's not a mandatory, but you could still have that be an option for a homeowner.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Jason, and then we'll go to Kevin.
Yeah, agree with Elizabeth. And I think that as solar panels become even, more efficient, it'll be perhaps the calculus will change for a new homeowner. And I have a question, residential versus commercial and the 150 square feet of rooftop compared to the 40% of allowable or, roof for the commercial. Is there any reason that they chose 150 square feet as opposed to some sort of percentage that made sense?
My guess would be that, once you get a solar array that's smaller than 150 square feet, it no longer fits that cost benefit number just because of the cost of the solar infrastructure. You wouldn't bother to put in a solar array that's smaller than that at this point, again, until the calculus changes.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. And then Kevin?
Yeah, I'm just going back to reading RB 103.1 more carefully. And it's pretty explicit that not less than 600 square feet. So if you have an ADU or a tiny home or something like that, these don't apply. So it's only in those instances, as Elizabeth said, that 103.2 through 103.8 would apply. And if the concern is about documentation of this as a design professional, I could say, let's draw a box on a plan and saying, this is the area. So it's not a burden from a design professional point of view to have that included.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Yeah, Jason.
And sorry, and, understood about not wanting to put a solar array less than 150 feet, but is there any reason, square feet, but is there any reason to not encourage more by having a higher number?
I couldn't see a reason against that. And again, the board has the jurisdiction to determine whatever, if you guys would like to see that be a higher square footage, then that's absolutely something you guys could consider and vote on. Carolyn, I see you.
Yeah, I
hand
mean,
up.
it might be worth putting a question out there just to understand the calculation behind that. Again, I think we want to drive towards feasibility as well. So I think maybe we can just take that as an action before we consider that, Kim, to just research that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. We can look into that. Elizabeth?
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna chime in and say, you know, if you've got that you have to have at least 600 square feet of area. And then the 150 square feet, like the roof area is what it is. But I would imagine a townhome, our roof usage is going to be a bit more dense than it is for a single family. You know, I'm thinking about like roof decks and, you know, plumbing vents and whatnot. Everything's just a bit more compressed than it is in a typical single family or duplexes. It sort of gut like feels like the right number but because it might be challenging to fit a larger number in there. And I'm thinking kind of about like, you know, you see townhomes in Denver, the roof areas are very, very used. And there really isn't a ton of roof area that's left.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Andrew, I see your hand. I'm going to keep us moving along if it's okay. If you have any final questions, I'd appreciate if you could drop them in the chat and we'll try and answer them as we go along. But I really want to make sure we have time to get through each section of this.
Kim, can I add one more comment in there just about kind of the townhomes and it has to do with how roof is defined by the code. That's your thermal, you know, your thermal surface that sees the sky as part of your building envelope. So it's not just your shingled area, but that would include any roof decks or anything that has to be insulated like a roof. So I think that's why the lesser square footage. And I'll shut up now. Thanks.
No, you're great. Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate the input. Okay, so focusing back in on this section 103.3, the solar ready zone as defined in the IECC residential appendix is the total solar ready zone area shall not be less than 300 square feet exclusive of mandatory access or setback areas as required by the International Fire Code. New townhouses 3 stories or less in height above grade plane and with a total floor area less than or equal to 2,000 square feet per dwelling shall have a solar ready zone area of not less than 150 square feet. Solar ready zone shall be composed of areas not less than 5 feet in width and not less than 80 square feet exclusive of access or setbacks as required by the International Fire Code. Now, if we look at where we've seen changes to this language within other Colorado jurisdictions, Denver has changed RB 103.3 to read the solar ready zone area reads as new townhouses 3 stories or less in height above grade plane as defined by the International Residential Code. So that's the piece that they added. And with the total floor area less than or equal to 2,000 square feet per townhouse unit, again, that's their new added language, shall have a solar ready zone area of not less than 150 square feet. The solar ready zone per townhouse unit shall be composed of areas. So those pieces in bold are the things that they changed just to clarify within the townhome that we're talking about a per unit townhome that the solar ready must apply to each unit. And then Vail made changes to their solar ready zone just to make specific reference to the Vail Fire Code. And so those are the only changes we've seen to the solar ready zone requirements from other jurisdictions in Colorado. Any questions or I guess discussion on what we would like out of this section? I'll go back one slide. Any suggested changes or things you guys like or dislike about this piece? Chris.
Thanks. So I guess a question for code folks is that specificity from Denver stating, you know, that the requirement for townhomes is per unit? Is that necessary to realize that outcome?
I think it's helpful.
I think this was Denver's way to address some of the inconsistencies between dwelling unit and building. Kevin, do you happen to remember?
Oh, that sounds right.
And I know that there was
And
the part where it's talking about the above grade versus below grade. Denver's got a couple of different definitions as it applies to like the green buildings ordinance and versus what the IRC and the IBC say. So that was just, it might be a little bit redundant for a non-Denver code. So I don't know that we need to add the as defined by the IRC for the definition of above grade plane. That's kind of, it's just already there.
Oh, Tim, I'm sorry. I was just talking and I was muted. Tim, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, so this, I like Denver's language, and this is where I would suggest if the board like this also, is to, that's where you clarify that 2,000 square foot of condition, and as Elizabeth pointed out, of condition space, not habitable space like I was talking about, but the condition space, so that if you did have that condition garage, it would then get included. But that would be my suggestion of some pretty good language with that additional language.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, Kevin.
Quick question on that. I'm just not as familiar with IRC specifically, but is the townhouse unit a code defined term? Do we know? So that we're not adding new code language in there that isn't defined. I can go looking. I just don't know anything off the top of my head.
Elizabeth.
Since I had to look this up recently, townhouse is defined by the IRC. It's not defined by the IECC, but dwelling unit is. So I think there is a reference for townhouse if you look at IRC. So it could go either way here.
Okay. Well, since most municipalities, usually adopt those as a lot, I guess is, as long as it's not conflicting one to the other, it could be defined in one place and not another.
And I think it says right in the IECC too at the very top that any term that's not defined in this code but is defined in another code will be, you will use the term as defined in another.
Perfect.
code.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm hearing for this, the section 103.3, that we like the Denver edits to be specific that these pieces are per townhome unit, and that also adding that that to clarify that we're talking about conditioned space when referencing the 2,000 square feet. Any other thoughts on this, or can we continue on to the next section? All right. Yeah, Adam?
I just had a question because we had kind of talked about the use of the word building versus dwelling unit in 103.1, and I'm wondering if we change the term to be dwelling unit up in 103.1, if that would satisfy the need to not include the phrase townhouse unit further down. So just that we're, I just, based on the suggestions that I've heard from multiple people, I'm wondering if that would satisfy the need to no longer need to specify it in 103.3.
Seems to make sense.
Yeah, Tim?
I would suggest leaving this that specific language in this section to clarify townhouses. I think it's good because this is pretty much a kind of a standalone section just for the townhouses, 3 stories or less. That's my opinion.
I support that too. It seems like the possibility for unintended consequences are thin because it's so narrow in scope.
Okay, awesome. All right, so moving along to 103.4 and 103.5. So this is where we get into obstructions and shading. So these two pieces are, shading is partially covered or required by statute, but the obstructions piece is not. So 103.4 for obstructions says the solar ready zone shall be free from obstruction, including but not limited to vents, chimneys, and roof mounted equipment. And then 103.5 for shading, the solar ready zone shall be set back from any existing or new permanently affixed object on the building or site that is located south, east or west of the solar zone, a distance of not less than 2 times the object's height above the nearest point on the roof surface. Such objects include, but are not limited to, taller portions of the building itself, parapets, chimneys, antennas, signage, rooftop equipment, trees, and roof plantings. So this piece takes the 70% or more shading threshold that we have in 103.1 and says you can't put anything on the roof that would then shade the solar ready zone. And then quickly, Carolyn, before I get to you, just to note the 2 communities that have made changes to these 2 sections, Boulder and Vail, both removed section 103.5 from their adopted code. Carolyn, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, and noting that we adopted our solar ready requirements before the 2021 IECC was issued. So that may not have been a deliberate removal. And then I would advocate for including requirements such as these to address just some concerns, for sure, the obstructions. And then I'm a fan of removing including the shading one as well.
I have to agree with Carolyn. I mean, our experience in laying these out, even in larger installations, is any shading is so detrimental, and without the intention of that, meaning be mindful for routing. I think we've all seen where trades will just run stuff up through the roof wherever they can. It could be counter to the intent of creating a zone. I mean, you could you'd have that 600 square foot area zone all set. One guy chucks up a pipe, mark out, and it diminishes the intent of making it available.
Here, here.
Yeah, Ron?
Yeah, I would just add on to that. This is one of those things where the actual upfront cost for doing it right is almost non-existent in some cases, but you can really ruin a whole roof by sticking things where they don't need to be.
Awesome. So I'm hearing that the board would advocate to keep both of these in place as far as our code language. And Don, I'll pass it to you.
So I'm going to offer a bit of a different opinion here. Maybe I'm in my real world, I'm a heating and cooling contractor. And, you know, it sounds all great and good when we're developing code, but it's not always the best case scenario, or sometimes there's no other options for getting from point A to point B. So while I understand the purpose and the desire here, I just get a little concerned that we're cutting our nose off to spite our face and possibly causing other problems in the future. So just food for thought.
And Don, can you clarify, are you speaking to both of these, or is
Yeah,
one?
I'm talking mostly obstructions.
Okay.
It's like I said, in a perfect world, yeah, this is great, but I can tell you in the real world, there's no such thing as perfect.
Thanks, Don. Adam, pass it to you.
Just note too that some of the language for the solar ready zone does provide opportunities for the zone to be broken up into smaller portions, which could be used to help get around any necessary obstructions down. So just wanted to point that out too, is that the solar ready zone doesn't have to be one contiguous area, but that it may be broken into several smaller areas that could help make that, if you added that obstruction provision in there, that it would allow for more flexibility for obstructions while still allowing for the solar ready zone to be there in multiple pieces. So I just wanted to put that out there as food for thought.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. All right, I'm not seeing any more hands for these sections, and so I'm gonna keep us moving along. The next 2 sections we get to in the appendix are for the capped roof penetration sleeve. The capped roofs. Wow, that's a hard one to say quickly. A capped roof penetration sleeve shall be provided adjacent to the solar ready zone, located on a roof slope of not greater than 1 unit vertical and 12 units horizontal, and that's the 8% slope. The capped roof penetration sleeve shall be sized to accommodate the future photovoltaic system conduit, but shall have an inside diameter of not less than 1.25 inches. And then for roof load documentation, this is the piece that is required by state statute. The structural design loads for the roof dead load and roof live load shall be clearly indicated on the construction documents. Any thoughts on these two provisions? Tim?
Can you explain, I read this last week, maybe I'm just not reading it correctly, but in 103.6, it gives direction to put this capped sleeve adjacent to the solar ready zone on a slope not greater than 1 in 12. And so how does this work when we have, say, a sloped roof, say 4 and 12? I mean, maybe I'm missing something. Aren't we requiring the solar ready zone to be available, say, on those sloped roofs, 4 and 12 or 6 and 12? Maybe I'm just missing it. Sorry.
That's a question that I don't know that I can answer. Is there anyone on the board that could speak to that? And Tim, let me actually, I apologize. I forgot to scroll through to the changes that Boulder and Denver have made to this. And so I'll just share these quickly in case it helps answer the question. Boulder does not have the capped roof penetration sleeve requirement. Again, that could be because there was an earlier version of this appendix adopted, and that requirement did not come into play until the 2021 code. And then Denver added that there must be a section for electric conduit, install a minimum 1-inch metal conduit for future PV system wiring below the capped roof penetration sleeve in the attic to the designated inverter location. The conduit shall be clear labeled as a solar ready component indicating its purpose and intended use, shall be capped on both ends. Conduit run shall be identified on construction documents. And then it adds this exception: if roof design is such that all conduit is run on the outside elevation of the house to the solar ready zone, then the capped roof penetration is not required, and only conduit future location shall be required to be indicated on the construction documents. Apologies, I forgot to cover that piece first. So Tim, I'm not sure that answers your question, but I also don't know that I have an answer for it.
That didn't answer my question, sorry.
Jason, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I think similar to Tim's question, I talked to our local solar installer, business, solar installation business, and they were, a lot of their customers like running the penetration underneath the array, which is usually on a here in Crested Butte, an 812 or maybe 1012, and for aesthetics. And so they were wondering why it was required to do that penetration on a 112.
We can absolutely follow up on that and see if we can't get you guys an answer the next time we chat about solar ready. I wrote that question down. Cody.
Yeah, I assume it has something to do with accessibility. Most low pitched roofs don't have access to attics where you could get in and get the conduit later and poke the penetration through. Most of the steeper pitch, 4, 5, 12 and up have a lot of access in the attic where you can get to it. So maybe it's, I don't know, but maybe it has something to do with that accessibility. And maybe we should tailor it to accessibility rather than the pitch of a roof.
Thanks, Cody. Tim?
Yeah, we've got townhomes, quite a few townhome projects that don't have any flat roofs. They're just all sloped roofs, with a peak going across, with the shared roof. So, and they're whatever, 412, 612 pitch. So if we move forward, I would suggest we get rid of the 1 and 12 section. And I also like the Denver amendment.
Thanks, Tim. And Thomas, thanks for your note in the chat that you also like Denver's exemption. Cody, do you have another thought or question? Oh, okay.
No, sorry. Thank you.
The only thing I don't love about that Denver amendment is it assumes that every building has an attic. I think a lot of the townhomes design or even residential you see might just be, truss space up in there. So that's a little, I would support removing the one, less than 1 and 12. But I don't love that attic language because a lot of buildings don't have an attic. Just they have an insulated cavity as a top plane for the builder.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Carolyn?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm not enamored with the added language above, but I like the exception language. So just offering that clarification. And then, yeah, I think there's maybe some homework we can do to look at if there's other examples or best practices out there. But I think ensuring that there's a clear path and the penetration is there, I think is the important part of this.
Okay, thank you all. So I'm hearing we will, there's support for taking out this slope requirement here, and then adding the exception from Denver that they've included. Jason.
Yeah, another comment was that 1 1/4 inch conduit was fairly large. And so does anybody have an opinion about for residential, whether we want to stick with that 1 1/4, or I think in Denver, they also talked about 1 inch. So yeah, any thoughts?
I don't know the code implications of it. I have a colleague who's doing this on his house right now, and he's grateful for that larger conduit because it's both meeting the requirement to get a new code requirement for an electrical outlet on the roof up, as well as the stuff in the solar panel down. So anybody who's ever run fire as part of their work would appreciate both.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a real cost difference, and so I'd err on the size of creating space.
Okay. And I have heard no comments on the roof load documentation, so I'm assuming that because this is part of state statute, there aren't any concerns about moving this piece forward. Andrew.
I did wish to raise this comment previously. This comment, I think, still goes to the whole section of RB 103, that all these sections on documentation I don't think apply. And I don't know why it would still have to apply in the state statute if a solar ready zone is not required. What does the documentation do? I don't read in here that 103.9 is still required or 103.10 is still required. The 103.2 through 103.10 all should be not applicable.
Yeah, Ron.
The solar ready zone.
Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that it's useful to have that documentation for whatever future solar might be added, even if it's not triggered by this regulation. Future homeowners may decide that they want to do something, and sometimes it can be tricky to figure this bit of information out. And it's relatively straightforward to add it at time of construction.
I just echo that. I mean, I think let's say you just fall short of the required zone, and panels are substantially more efficient in 10 years time, which there will be. You still have the route with which to serve intended use.
Thanks, guys. Excuse me. Okay. So continuing on through to sections 103.8, and again, this is the last piece that's sort of required by the solar ready zone. Construction documents shall indicate pathways for routing of conduit or plumbing from the solar ready zone to the electric service panel or service hot water system. RB 103.9 reads, the main electric service panel shall have reserved space to allow installation of a dual pole circuit breaker for future solar electric installation and shall be labeled as such. The reserved space shall be positioned at the opposite load end from the input feeder location or the main circuit location. And just looking at a couple of pieces, I guess differing pieces and different solar ready provisions that we reviewed for Boulder County, they have an added section for a solar pre-wire option. And this basically says every new single family detached residence shall include one of the following: a PV system or a solar thermal system, or upgrades of wiring or plumbing or both installed by the builder to accommodate the future install of residential solar generation system or a solar thermal system, or metallic chase or conduit or both constructed to allow ease of future installation of the necessary wiring or plumbing for a residential PV system or solar thermal system or both. So it gives those options. The city of Denver, for the interconnection pathway, added that the construction document shall indicate a location reserved for inverters and metering equipment as a pathway reserved for routing of conduit from the solar zone to the point of interconnection with the electric service. For single-family residences and central water heating system, the construction document shall indicate a pathway for routing of plumbing from the solar-ready zone to the water heating system. And then for the reserved space, they added, they have the change from a 2-pole circuit breaker to a 2 or 3-pole circuit breaker. And that last piece, that last edit from Denver is coming through from the last section we'll look at in a moment. Avon sorry, there are a couple changes, and then Carolyn, I'll get to you. Avon changed the electric reserve space to replace the main electric service panel shall to say the primary electric service installed must be a minimum of a 200 amp all-in-one solar ready load center for 1 and 2 family dwellings or townhomes. The supply conduit must be a minimum of 2 inches. And then for Wheat Ridge, the main electric service panel shall have a reserved space to allow for the installation of a dual pole circuit breaker for future solar electric installation and shall be labeled. So they just sort of had it as a separate piece there. So anyway, those are the changes that we've seen to these code language pieces. And Carolyn, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, and I think this is one where I was going to seek a legal interpretation. Just recalling that the legislation called out the word conduit. In my opinion, I think the pathway is the strategy that we want to go through rather than trying to lay out the conduit in all cases. But I'm wondering if we can within the constraints of the legislation. So I just wanted to flag that as something to talk about. And then the other thing I just wanted to note is I do think there's some opportunity here to discuss whether we want to provide some of these proposed clarifications around what is adequate service and space within the panel versus some of the others that are just more generic. I think there's opportunity to be more specific. So those are my two things. One's more question and the other is a recommendation.
David, do you want to weigh in on her question?
I guess I have a question about your question. I'm not clear exactly what you're asking. I'll just say it like that.
Yeah, so the legislative wording references, and Kim, it's like at the very beginning of this slide deck. Electrical conduit. So solar ready includes being an electrical conduit. And I'm making sure we're solid in interpreting that to mean the pathway for the conduit versus the actual installed conduit.
Yeah, I think that's outside my pay grade. I'd like to hear a conversation about it, and then I can weigh in on it. Sounds
I would argue intent is to make sure that the intent here is to minimize the future cost for somebody coming back and adding solar. And I believe the pathway sufficiently does that, and stranding conduit investment may not be necessary to achieve that, but that's my opinion. Certainly open to others. I know, Ron, I think you require the conduit installation, and I think there's a couple others that do as well. So I think we just need to discuss that nuance and then figure out if we're on legal ground.
And Ron, before you answer that, can someone just explain to me the distinction between the pathway and the electrical conduit?
The pathway is the place where you can come back in later and install conduit. It's shown on the drawings versus actually installing the conduit at the time of construction.
Is a pathway just empty space?
This is where it goes. Yeah, it's just on a drawing. It shows where you would come in and install the conduit if you chose to use that path rather than going along the exterior of the structure. And my experience is that most later installs or retrofit installs, they're going around the exterior and not using the conduit. But I think that's a question also for others like Ron and Elizabeth, who might have some experience with that.
And then just to follow up, and the conduit is the actual wires?
No, it's just the pipe.
It's pipe, okay. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to mention is I think that we need to have a little bit of flexibility in what these terms mean. Like Carolyn was saying, it's about the intent. So, for instance, a conduit is a tube, but you also could put wires in metal in wiring trays that are designed to hold the wire. It's not a conduit, but it is for the purposes of making a place to put the wires and contain those wires, even though it's not actually a conduit. That would certainly meet the intent of what the legislators were getting at. And I think to Carolyn's larger point, I think that what we're trying to do here with the legislators seem to be trying to do is make it so that there was a clear place to put the wires where to reduce that secondary cost of coming back in and adding it. So I think a little bit of flexibility in terms of what that term conduit means is probably going to be useful here.
Right. And just to follow on that, let me ask you this. Does it seem to you the spirit of this solar ready is to provide, you've got panel space, you've got panel capacity, you've got roof space, structural load. None of those are actual things, right? They're the ability to making it easy to add things. Is that
right? And what you want to do in this case is specifically when we're talking about the conduit is make sure there's a clear and easy way to connect the solar panels, the future solar panels that are going to be installed in the roof with the electrical panel that we've made room for wherever that panel is. So there, we need the spot on the roof, we need the spot in the electrical panel, and then we need a way to connect these two things easily without undue expense. And so I think that's the piece that we need to sort of flush out is what does that connection between those two locations look like?
And then let me ask, could someone push back on that and argue that no, conduit means conduit, and there is no wiggle room, and that just because it's in the context of this list of things, in fact, the legislature used the word conduit here, and that means something specific. Because that would be the counter argument. Is someone willing to make that counter argument? Even just for the sake of argument, can someone make that argument?
Thanks, David. You're making me wish we had caught that one. I don't think that's the intent.
Yeah, I mean, the only
Go
go ahead,
Kevin,
please.
Yeah, I think saying electrical conduit is probably incorrect too. It would just be conduit. But this is directly from legislation.
I mean, I think the only counter argument in my mind is that it's the words say electrical conduit. I mean, that's the only really counter argument is that's actually what it says. But I would also bring the counter argument that because throughout the solar readiness, codes, we also talk about solar thermal. If you install conduit, that necessarily also, versus if you just reserve space reserved could be used for plumbing as well, versus, conduit would be exclusive only to, the electrical, as opposed to, precluding plumbing too in most cases. I mean, not necessarily completely precluding, but it's more referring to the electrical side.
Right. Well, because I'm not familiar with the term conduit or electrical conduit, let me do a little digging. I mean, I think Adam's pushback is exactly what I was looking for, which is, if that word has a clear meaning, it's going to be hard for you all to adopt something other than that clear meaning without being at some risk, right? So let me dig in that a little bit, and I'll talk to Adam and Kim, and whatever draft we all come up with will be something that you can talk about next time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, David.
Yep.
Awesome. Elizabeth.
Oh, I was just going to chime in as we look for definitions and things. Like we were talking about, what's the definition of building and all of that. You could go up the tiers of the different codes. I was just looking to see, and David, maybe as you look for the legal definition of this, where do we define the word conduit, especially electrical conduit? It's probably in the NEC. So I don't see that as necessarily an issue per se, because it's somewhere, the definition of conduit. I do also recall in other, and maybe other jurisdictions have had this conversation about, do we have to provide that physical pipe the conduit? Or can we just, allow someone to say, oh, the pathway is, on the outside of the building. And the worry there was that if you allow people just to define the pathway as being on the outside of the building, that's what everyone would do. And so it was intentional to require the physical conduit. Now, if and when one goes to install that and wants to use something else and do it on the outside of the building, that's fine. But to provide that pipe rather than forcing or potentially allowing a loophole there would be the preferable option.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Andrew.
If you could put the statute back up, please. David, Andrew, am I to interpret this statute? Maybe this is a question for you, maybe it's for the board, that is it the intent of the statute that one must satisfy each and every one of these, or is it the intent that they only be satisfied each and every one in the solar ready zone? That's a question.
I'm not clear of the distinction you're drawing.
The distinction I'm attempting to draw is that the appendix to the code, only if there's a solar ready zone do all the requirements apply. I still disagree with several board members as to the construction documentation. But here in the statute, solar ready means each and every of the following. So how do I, is it the intent that solar ready applies when there's a solar ready zone?
Right. So I'm still not following the distinction. So are you saying
he's asking, can he get an exemption from having to do all this stuff if he has determined he doesn't have a solar ready zone?
Right. I don't know the answer to that question. That's something that's something that came up earlier in our conversation today.
And that's a very legitimate and serious question, that if there isn't a zone, the code itself says, if I heard every member, that one only must comply if there is at least 600 square feet oriented between, then all the other provisions apply. Only then do all the other provisions apply, not any provision in of itself separately from if there's less than 600 square feet. I don't see where the electrical service or the interconnection pathway or the documentation applies. But here I'm asking, is the intent of the statute that if there is a solar ready zone, each of these apply?
I don't recall seeing in the statute any exemption from the other requirements if it is determined that you don't have a solar ready zone, but I defer to my colleagues on that.
I agree with that, Kristen. I'd have to go back and look, but for the sake of, but to answer your second question, I think it's the second question, right? If there is a solar ready zone, do each of these need to apply? Is that what you're asking?
But I think the code sets forth that if there is a solar ready zone, 103.2 through 103.10 apply. If there is no solar ready zone, 103.2 through 103.10 do not apply. How does that coexist with the intent of the statute?
I think if I can interject, the HB 22-1362, all the statute does is it tasks us, the board, with establishing a solar ready code. And this is what solar ready code needs to address. And that our solar ready code can define the projects that need to meet specific, or the buildings that need to meet specific requirements with respect to these highlighted items. So I think this might be a little semantics, and maybe we can verify that, but that was my understanding of what we were tasked to do.
Elizabeth, from you, that I hear that you're saying that under the premise that the solar ready zone is the path of the model code that the board adopts consistent with other adoptions, then the other requirements are predicated upon the solar ready zone, if the board elects that.
Correct. We're creating a solar ready code, and then there's going to be lots of different determinations as to whether a project would have to do anything within that code. Our code just needs to address all of these items.
David, just in the interest of time, I know we haven't even gotten to commercial solar ready yet. Why don't you and I talk about this offline, and we can bring an answer back next time.
I think that's a good idea, Adam. And I think I've been taking notes during this, and I think I isolated your question, Andrew. I think I heard 2 questions. So why don't I work with Adam and Kim on that? And again, whatever draft we bring to you next time will reflect our shared understanding.
Sounds great. Thanks, Dad. Thanks, David. Elizabeth, did you have another thought on these 2 residential sections? Okay.
No, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So in the interest of time, I am going to keep us moving. I am not hearing any, I guess this piece here, actually, let me circle back before I move on. What I heard from Elizabeth, and I guess the question was from Carolyn, do we actually need to run the conduit or not? Elizabeth, I believe you shared that your understanding is that the intent is that the physical conduit is run in order to be as cost effective as possible for future installations. But any other thoughts on, where we should fall as far as requiring the conduit be there, and knowing that David will sort of dive into the intent behind the statute offline. Carolyn.
Yeah, I feel like maybe we should have some conversations with solar installers and understand the extent to which they would utilize the conduit to inform that. And I can put a question out to some of ours along those lines if others would like to do the same. I think that would help inform because I agree if it's going to drive people to utilize it, it is a low first cost of installation. If it's not going to be used at all, I think it's an unnecessary cost. So that would be my place.
Thanks, Carolyn. Brad?
I'll just really quickly weigh in. This is an item that we had in our 2018 code, the requirement for conduit. It was removed when we adopted our 2021 code. It was removed because almost 0 solar installations in town utilize the conduit. What we heard from the solar contractors is that they preferred to run it on the exterior. They did not want to enter the house. They did not want to enter the attic. So almost no conduit was used. I don't dislike the conduit, by the way. I think it's a lot cleaner look, but if it's not being used, if it's not going to be used, something to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Adam?
Can I just offer that perhaps this needs to be predicated on whatever determination David makes, because I think, if the determination is that the statute requires the conduit, this is kind of a moot discussion, versus if there's some flexibility there, then there's room for discussion. So can I suggest that the board put a pin in this until that is resolved, that determination is resolved?
Yeah, I think that's great, Adam. And I would still encourage folks, Carolyn, to reach out to solar installers, and Lotus can do the same, and just get that perspective in case it does come back to be a wash, or the board still has that decision, so we can make, we can at least have done our homework ahead of that discussion to make an informed decision. Okay. Awesome. So then finally, the last section of the residential solar ready zone, or solar ready code, excuse me, is that the permanent certificate must indicate the solar ready zone and must be posted by a builder or the registered design professional. Any quick thoughts on this? Anyone disagree with this or want to offer up a change to this suggested change? Andrew.
Yeah, I know I've said this once or twice. I don't think this is required. And nobody's convinced me yet that it is. If there is no solar ready zone.
Thanks, Andrew. And again, yep, this is something that the board would have a decision to, that it's not required by state statute. So this board would be able to decide and vote on that. John.
I'm going to agree with Andrew here. I think this is a bit of an overreach, and I see other problems coming from this requirement.
Okay, thank you both for sharing that feedback. Okay, so
Kevin.
Sorry, I was actually just
Kevin and Mitch.
thanks, Ken. I'm just going to agree with Andrew, Don, and maybe for a different reason, is it'd be really atypical for the registered design professional to have a requirement to post that with a completed building. I can't see that working. So I'm good with leaving that out. We could encourage it perhaps through there, but recommend it, but to have that fall on a registered design professionals is probably great.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Tim, did you want to add anything there?
Well, I was going to recommend, but before I took my hand back down, because I think it might already be answered, that 103.9 and 103.10, I agree with Andrew and Don. But if you don't have a zone, then I would disagree. I don't think you need to have those sections just, adopted. But if you had the zone, then the 0.9 and 0.10 would be needed. But I think those are probably already up in the upper sections. So.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And then Carolyn.
Yeah, I don't agree with Tim on 103.9 or Andrew. I feel the monumental cost to the homeowner at a later date coming back in and having to modify this is material when you talk about the service reserve space. And so I think we still need to accomplish that. I don't have a strong feeling about 103.10. Tend to agree with Kevin that I think it is an unusual thing, and I don't necessarily think that this is as critical to advancing the intent. I think I still have my open question on 103.9 as to what that space needs to be. And whether we want to be more specific about 2 or 3 pole breakers, amperage or anything there, but I feel pretty strongly that this provision needs to be part of what we put forward.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. I think that it sounds like these points might come down to sort of a final discussion and vote from the board. And so I appreciate everyone sharing their thoughts. And as you guys, following this meeting, as you guys are looking at this code language and think that there's any manipulations we can make to the language to make it more accessible across the board, we can absolutely cover those when we dive into the code language itself. So with that, I think we'll continue on to talking about the commercial solar ready frameworks. And with an eye on time, making sure we have enough time to discuss all of these various pieces. So same definition here, solar ready zone is the roof section or building overhang designated and reserved for future PV or thermal system installation. And I just want to note that the city of Boulder has its own written solar readiness code for commercial. And so with respect to how we've sort of organized the slides, it will go appendix language, city of Boulder language, and then any other edits from other jurisdictions across Colorado, just so we can make sure we're sharing all of the relevant pieces with you guys. So starting with the section 103.1, this is the general requirement section. A solar ready zone shall be located on the roof of buildings that are 5 stories or less in height above grade plane and are oriented between 110 and 270 degrees of true north or have low sloped roofs. Solar ready zones shall comply with sections 103.2 through 103.9 Exceptions with this general requirement include buildings with a permanently installed on-site renewable energy system, a building with a solar-ready zone that's shaded more than 70% of daylight hours annually, where a licensed design professional certifies that the incident solar radiation available to the building is not suitable for a solar-ready zone, or where the licensed design professional certifies that the solar-ready zone area required by section 103.3 cannot be met because of extensive rooftop equipment, skylights, vegetated roof areas, or other obstructions. Looking at the City of Boulder requirements, this general requirement reads: all newly constructed commercial buildings shall comply with their solar-ready requirements. One of those being orientation, which is noted slightly further down in their language, that all sections of the solar-ready zone located on steep slope roofs shall be oriented between 90 degrees and 270 degrees of true north. And then Crested Butte has a change in their general requirements that say buildings less than 5,000 square feet shall be solar ready. Buildings that are greater than 5,000 square feet or are 5,000 square feet or larger shall install PV on the roof. So just to note that change. And then there's also a requirement within the Crested Butte language that commercial level 3 alterations that are 5,000 square feet or less shall install solar ready components. Level 3 alterations that are greater than 5,000 square feet shall install solar. Denver made a couple of changes to this general requirement section. The definition of the solar ready zone, they removed the word overhang from that definition and then added a new section to clarify all newly constructed buildings within those occupancies that you see there shall designate the solar ready zone. This zone shall be located on a roof or overhang of the building or on the roof or overhang of another structure located within 250 feet of the building, on the building premises, or on a covered parking installed within the project. So Denver added that occupancy group clarification, and they also added an allowance for that solar readiness to be on another structure on the property or on the covered parking. And they have exceptions: building with 6 or more stories above grade and buildings that already have a PV system installed. And then Lafayette changed their general definition that major commercial alterations. So basically, this is any commercial building where work area exceeds 50% would have to comply with the solar ready requirements per Lafayette's code. And that is all. So I'm going to scroll back to our general requirements and I'll open the floor and would love to know any thoughts from the board on what you guys like and don't like about this section. Ron?
I was just going to say that where there's an exception for already installed systems, I think it is useful to have a little bit of some kind of minimum requirement in terms of what that system is producing. We don't want people just to put a token system up there, but actually put something up there that's useful.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Chris?
Yeah, similar to Ron, I had questions. Not sure if folks on the board, have an idea of how the on-site systems, usually show up. But, I wonder whether we might consider, a like percentage of modeled energy consumption kind of threshold if we wanted to make the on-site renewable system exemption more specific.
I think that's a good question, Chris and Tim and Elizabeth. Tim, I'll go to you first, and Elizabeth to you next.
Thank you. I was on a Xcel Energy lunch session last week on this particular one, and I asked a question there, but I'll ask it for the benefit of the board. The exception, in a way, that says if you're 6 stories or taller, which Denver actually wrote in, same thing. Can you explain where that came from or what the intent is. And the reason I ask is the answer I got last week was, well, usually when you're going taller, you got a smaller building footprint. And I have quite a few pretty large footprint buildings that are going up that are, 6 stories, 7 stories that have a lot of room up on the roof. So I was just curious if it was just the intent was the taller you go, the smaller the roof it is, which I wouldn't disagree.
Tim, I can answer that for Denver. It has to do with the Green Buildings Ordinance, which applies to buildings that are greater than 5 stories. So those buildings have actually more restrictive requirements. So they left the solar ready zone for only those that were 5 stories and less. That's the only reason that this is in here.
And Tim, I can share from the work in the code cohorts that we've been doing, the communities that are working on adopting that code language. The general requirements in this section basically were taken out to say it applies to any commercial building and removed the height limitation piece. With that sort of perspective in mind, Tim, that yes, in some cases, roof space becomes more limited when you get taller, but in others, it's not really relevant. Carolyn?
Did Elizabeth get hers in, or was she just answering?
Oh, sorry, Elizabeth.
Oh, I do have another, opinion, I guess. Boulder's amendment here does not have the exception for the on-site renewable energy, and I actually prefer that. If I'm remembering correctly, and Boulder people tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that if you have, say, a smaller solar array, you still have to show that solar ready zone, meaning that, I think it's 40% of your roof area, even if you have a solar array installed. And I like the logic behind that is that, eventually they do want you to expand that solar array, and that's not a get out of jail free card per se. So I would vote to not have that exception here.
Yeah, and I was going to make the same advocacy on the commercial side, because the obstructions on a commercial roof can be very significant and challenged. Like it's where the ability to add solar later is the most challenging. So I would tend towards only making the exception if the system installed is equivalent, to Chris's point, that meets some percentage already of the solar zone, so that they don't have to demonstrate everything else because they've already met it, or that there is still a solar zone requirement in the case of commercial.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, Elizabeth. Any thoughts on that piece? It seems, I guess I'll share the perspective from looking at this from a cost-effective standpoint. Keeping things simple by way of mimicking something like that, what the city of Boulder has, would save folks from needing to do that analysis or do that energy modeling work to understand their energy consumption and the offset from the solar that might be installed on the roof. Alternatively, if the board, thinks that could be a real pinch point, then that's something we can definitely consider. Kim.
I would agree with Carolyn's statement that she just made, and I also had a question mostly on the last exemption that was there, exception. It just seems to me like that could be a really easy one for somebody to kind of get out of jail free type of card because of things that they put on a roof. So I'm curious as to if others have insights or knowledge on that exemption.
Yeah, Elizabeth, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, as a person who has documented that, it's very rare that it comes up and projects really can't meet it. But the licensed design professional is putting their license on the line for this sort of thing. So the other licensed professionals, architects and whatnot, who are on the line, who are allowed to certify that, that's not a small matter. I think it is safe for the state or a jurisdiction to trust the design professional in that case, because it's that's our livelihood on the line. It's not just the contractor saying it, or the building owner saying it, but it's the mechanical engineering saying this is the clearance that we need for this condensing unit. And somebody could game the system by, say, scattering out your condensing units around the building, but it ends up being more expensive and it would just be foolish. So I don't see this being a problem.
Thanks for pointing that out. I guess I hadn't thought of it from the licensed design professional side of things, even though I am one. It just hadn't occurred to me. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm hearing so far is that potentially we would like to remove that first exemption for a permanently installed on-site renewable energy system. The rest I haven't heard anything stated against those. The other alternative, so we keep those three. The other alternative would just be to keep things more simple and go with something like the City of Boulder that, and again, theirs is written differently. So I'll just flag that it is not sort of the same structure as the appendix within the code. But any other thoughts on these exemptions before we continue, Tim?
Yeah, if I could just go back. So the Boulder amendment, or not the Boulder code, I should say. So when it just says 406.2 through 406.5, is that mean that they don't have that exception for above 5 stories above grade plane?
Yeah, you can't build 5 stories in Boulder, so.
Well, okay.
Unless you're CU.
Unless you're CU or Google. No, I'm sorry.
No, we can't regulate them anyway. So.
Understood. I mean, I'm just.
It's also worth noting we require, so like Crested Butte, we require the solar actually be installed on all commercial projects. So just noting that as well.
The reason I'm asking is, once again, I was just thinking about some other multifamily projects that we've had, and we are getting ready to get in for permit, and they're going to be 4 or 5 story R2 apartment buildings on podium parking. So in one case, I've got a project coming in later this summer on 2 stories of parking. So effectively a 7-story building above grade plane. And it's a large footprint because it's a multifamily project. And they've got a big well up top for all the air conditioner units, but the whole thing's got a perimeter slope Mansard type roof system where they could easily get solar. So, I mean, to me, the concept of, well, the taller you get, the smaller roof, I think generally speaking, then if we were going to do something, if the board's going something like this, that you get rid of that exception and then put in some kind of other language that says, if there's not enough room somehow or another from the design professional that can accommodate enough solar. And is that really the intent, is to provide enough solar in this ordinance to handle the entire building? So I think I was kind of embedding my comments with some more questions. Sorry.
No, thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Kevin and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, I guess quickly, I'd agree that the height limitation, particularly as that relates to what it did for Denver, I don't see it. We design a lot of tall buildings and still can find room. I think the only point where that becomes constrictive to them is if, kind of like Boulder does, frankly, is that there's a percentage of energy required, because that starts to tilt it against so a little bit. So I was trying to flip that through and see where there's a percentage of power required. But there's no reason a 12-story building or higher shouldn't have these on it. We do it all the time.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And Carolyn agrees as well with Tim's comment. Elizabeth?
Yeah, that the 5 stories or less, that's just a Denver thing, and it just has to do with the green buildings ordinance. So everybody just check that out. Doesn't apply to anywhere else. I think we're kind of covered, for the tall, skinny buildings, the big, broad buildings. It's 40% of the roof area. It's not an energy offset, which is, different options of the code under C406. For that tall, skinny building, if it doesn't fit, you've got this third exception here, or even the fourth exception here, where, you know, you just kind of do your best. And, you know, if you can't hit that 40%, you do the best you can. But that mansard style, and we've been able to hit the 40% with that style. And yeah, absolutely makes sense. I think, you know, a typical multifamily project shouldn't have an issue for the most part.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. And Thomas had a question in the chat. Can someone refresh me on the rationale to remove the first exemption? And someone correct me if I misstate this, but I believe the rationale was to make sure that a building is not just putting on a small PV array that might not be really meeting the intent of providing roof space to meet that 40%, to fill that 40% solar ready zone. So if someone just throws a couple panels on the roof, making sure that they're not exempted from providing the panel space and all of the other components of solar readiness to fill the rest of the roof with more solar. Okay, awesome. So
qualified with an installed watts per square foot or something like that, and keep it, but with qualification.
Yeah, I think that was the other suggestion, was to say if we do keep it, making sure that on-site renewable energy system meets some threshold.
Okay, thank you.
I would just have the threshold be 40% of your roof area. I don't see real need to define an energy offset per se, because the roof area is the solar ready code. You know, that's how we define our zone, is by roof area. So if you exceed the roof area, you've by default met your solar ready zone requirements. So if we wanted to say that, or put something in explicitly here, you could just say on-site renewable energy system that exceeds 40% of your roof area.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Ron?
I was just going to say that the only downside I could see to just sticking to just an area is that someone might come up with a system that's much more efficient than what's common on the marketplace. Someone could put a tracking system up on a roof or something like that that maybe overproduces what would have been there. So that's the only reason I think that just sticking to the area is probably not the perfect solution.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Ron. Any other thoughts here before we continue on?
I'll only just chime in as, again, someone who's had to document that solar energy offset. It's expensive for someone to do that, you know, so if we were to have it be an energy offset requirement, you're basically requiring that they have an energy model and that they have somebody spend some money to do that and document it. So, you know, as much as I like the job security, I don't think we want to put that impetus on people.
You could have it just a calculation that shows it produces as much as would be produced with 40% of the area or something like that.
Yeah, it still just gets kind of messy.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. I'm going to continue us on to moving through section 103.2. So this one is similar to the other section we saw in the residential appendix, that just make sure that the construction documents indicate the solar ready zone. I heard no concerns about that from folks on the residential side, so I'm going to assume people feel similarly on the commercial side, but correct me if I stated that wrong and anyone wants to share a thought. The solar ready zone area within the commercial appendix reads, the total solar ready area shall be not less than 40% of the roof area, calculated as the horizontally projected gross roof area less the area covered by skylights, occupied roof decks, vegetative roof areas, and mandatory access or setbacks as required by the fire code. The solar ready zone shall be in a single area or smaller separated subzone areas. Each subzone shall not be allowed to be less than 5 feet in width in the narrowest dimension. Are there any concerns or thoughts or suggested changes with the solar ready zone area? Carolyn.
So Deborah had the opportunity to place the solar zone on an adjacent structure. I'm not necessarily advocating for that. I was just wondering, is this the place it would be? Really? Is this kind of the context?
They had theirs included within the general section, I believe. indicating where the zone shall be located. But I don't see any reason why it couldn't be included here, if that was something the board was interested in.
I'm not advocating for it. I just wanted to ask the question.
Tim.
Yeah, I actually like that that exception in the Denver. I've actually got 2 large multifamily projects that are under construction right now. And they're both 4 stories and have an associated or attached, I should say, parking garage that handles those entire buildings. And I haven't seen this yet, but I know I've heard of other projects, talking to some of my colleagues who work on big projects where the solar arrays are starting to go in on that upper tier to handle the actually the multifamily portion. So I'm not sure if this would be considered. I mean, it's part of the same address, but that's more of a technicality, but that would be a different building adjacent to. So I like that concept if they're somehow proven to be associated with the primary building, I guess.
Thanks, Tim. Do others have thoughts on that piece of the Denver? And we'll just scroll over back to the Denver amendment. Elizabeth?
Yeah, this came about. I think most folks know Denver rolled in all R2, even 3-story and below, into their commercial code. So this is really in response to folks wanting to have solar carports and to put solar in that was not sitting on top of the building, because that actually made it easier for those type of projects. And we're talking like walk-up multifamily, right? Made it easier for those types of projects to feed their house meter when they weren't physically located on buildings that didn't have the house meter. So that was in response to that community request.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Kevin?
I think, speaking from experience, that this has been helpful to have the use of adjacent structures. A small multifamily project that had a certain requirement for the load service. This was down in Arizona, but we did use it was a 60-unit apartment. We had to use the solar array on a carport because we couldn't do it otherwise. So I like the ability to put it elsewhere if possible.
Thanks, Kevin. Carolyn?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this conversation gets at that exception for the solar project. Like, I think there's something to be said for, like, if they're installing it initially and utilizing something like a carport, there should be some discretion to not also require it on the roof space. But I wonder, again, because this is solar ready, so it's for the next owner to come back in and add later. Like what I think that needs to be on the roof space itself. So I just push this into the exception category if we allow for a renewable energy system that provides the equivalency, which could include a system installed on an adjacent structure, to just leave space for that creativity without saddling future costs to somebody else.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. All right, any other thoughts here on, the solar ready zone area requirements? Not hearing any, so I'm going to keep us moving. I did forget to share the City of Boulder zone. The zone shall be comprised of one or more rectangular areas. They're not less than 80 square feet. Similar, they've got the 5 foot in length in one dimension. And the zone shall be located on the roof or overhang, or the roof or overhang of a structure located within 250 feet of the building on the same parcel or lot. And so, Carolyn, so you have the same solar ready requirement within the city of Boulder. It sounds like that it could be in the solar readiness could be on an adjacent structure.
We do.
But to make sure I'm understanding you correctly, this is not something that you're supportive of unless it's applying to the actual installed renewable energy system.
Well, or to the degree that that structure is dedicated and already there, like I wouldn't want like, well, they can add carport later, or the carport doesn't meet the intent of the solar ready requirements. So I can leave some room for how it can be met, but just making sure that it's specific enough to still meet the intent of the legislation.
Okay. And then continuing the 40% roof area and so on and so forth. And so this part is within the PDF that you guys have. So if you guys want to dive a little deeper, I'm going to continue moving us through the appendix language. So the appendix also has a requirement around obstructions. The solar ready zone shall be free from obstructions, including pipes, vents, ducts, HVAC, skylights, and roof mounted equipment. I heard some support for this in the residential side of things. Is there anybody that does not agree? I know, Don, you'd shared that this can be tricky on specific projects, but anyone that would want to advocate for removing or changing this piece? Okay, awesome. I'm going to continue on. This again is very similar language to the residential. And then City of Boulder has their obstruction requirements. Yeah, Thomas, pass it to you.
Is there a way to qualify that the obstruction exemption for if it's an existing building, like if this is a renovation and you've got existing obstructions and you're having to modify the roof and reroute plumbing vents and things like that. New construction, that's easy to plan around, but like Don was saying, on an existing building, it can be very difficult and expensive.
So Thomas, these requirements would apply as far as I think the discussion has been so far to just new construction rather than existing buildings or retrofits. Okay. Okay. So there are a couple of obstruction amendments that Denver made. So let's see, the obstructions including but not limited to vents, chimneys, architectural fixtures, and roof mounted equipment. Any obstruction located on the roof or any other part of the building that projects above the solar zone shall be located 2 times the height of the obstruction from the closest edge of the solar zone. And then there are exceptions if the roof obstruction is coming from another roof, or if the equipment designated for solar water heating systems, if present, are permitted to be installed in the solar zone. So any thoughts or interest in the amendments from Denver on this section for obstructions? Carolyn?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the shading issue, and their addition is trying to get at the shading issue. So I do think there's something to be said for not allowing installed equipment to shade this on the same roof to shade the solar zone.
Yeah, and that's similar to the language we saw in the residential side. Okay.
So, sorry, could you confirm, Kim, that isn't in the base code, right? There's nothing about shading. I was just glancing through it.
Yeah, I'm just triple checking, but I believe that that's correct. The only piece that talks about shading other than the 70% exemption is that obstruction, is this language here. Okay. The next section, 103.5, roof loads and documentation. This gets at making sure that the roof can hold the collateral dead load of not less than 5 pounds per square foot shall be included in the gravity and lateral design calcs of the solar ready zone, and that the structural design loads are on the construction document. So again, very similar requirement to the residential. And I'm just going to keep moving because we're running close on time. So flag or stop me or raise your hand if you guys want to share any thoughts. Moving into the interconnection pathway, the construction document shall indicate the pathways for routing of conduit or piping from the solar ready zone to the electric service panel, and the energy storage ready system area or service hot water system. Recall that this appendix requires energy storage ready area to be in the building. So this 103.6 specifically states that just the construction documents shall indicate the pathway of routing or piping and does not specifically require that that piping or conduit be installed. So again, when Adam and David and I have a chance to circle up offline and figure out if this is actually a required part of the state statute, we'll bring that back to you guys. And then 103.7, the electrical energy storage ready system area. This just means you have to have floor area set aside for the future electric energy storage system. And that location and diagram of the system shall be indicated on the construction drawings. This is not part of the requirements that we must include for solar readiness for state statute. So this one would be open for board discretion. And I'd like to open the floor and just see if there are any initial thoughts on keeping this part of the appendix in place or taking it out for our purposes. Kevin.
That feels like a pretty sensible add for future usability. I don't see it as a big position.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Carolyn?
Yeah, I would tend to, at a minimum, include it as a recommended provision. And I also think it's such a small area. It doesn't feel like it's much of an imposition to require it.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. Ron? Ron, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I would have just agreed with what was just said. I think it's a really useful thing to put in there.
Okay, Chris. Yeah.
Just joining the choir, I would advocate for adding or at the very minimum, or at the very least require or recommending.
Okay, great. Well, I'm hearing general support, so we can go ahead and move forward with including this language in our code draft that we'll present to you guys. And then if there are folks that are in disagreement, we can maybe cross that bridge when we get there. And then I'm just going to scoot through to the electric service reserve space. So this reads the same as the residential provisions, that you must have that space. And again, it is not very clear on how much space that should be. Carolyn.
I think the commercial is one where we need to provide clarity
On the amount of space.
Mm-hmm. These systems can be fairly large and require sufficient service. And I know we have it in ours.
And let's take a look at what that language looks like. So City of Boulder, for the electric service, has the main electric service panel shall have a minimum bus bar rating of not less than 200 amps. The main electric service panel shall have reserved space to allow for the future installation of the double pole circuit breakers for future solar electric installations. The minimum reserved amperage shall be determined by the table in their code, which would give that minimum requirement. And Carolyn, do you all feel like as you move through, as the City of Boulder updates their code, that the amperage or the minimum requirements you guys have determined here would change?
No, I don't think we anticipate changing those. We have that table, it was you included it in the PDF. But
okay.
Yeah, that would be my advocacy.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the minimum, the minimum reserve space for electric service? Okay. Well, thanks, Carolyn, for that. It's going to be a helpful reference point as we pull together language to include something like that. And then our final section, I believe this is the final section here, that the construction documentation certificate. So again, the permanent certificate must be posted by a builder registered design professional. It sounded like the board was maybe split half and half on this as far as the residential requirements. So I'd love to hear if anyone has any thoughts or points to share on the construction or on the commercial side. Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I just echo that. I think it could be a recommendation, not a requirement. Difficult maybe to design professionals do within a building.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. Any other thoughts on this piece? Okay. Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, this is already documented in the design documents, right? Just seems redundant.
I get the intent of it. I just think the execution of it's problematic to have it in the code. Jurisdiction can choose to, but at a state level, it feels like an emergent code.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Okay. Well, with that, I believe that gets us through all of the solar ready pieces. I feel like we have a ton of great feedback to sift through. I think we've got plenty to draft that first language to bring back to you guys, understanding that we will meet with David and clarify a few of those state statute language pieces. And that where I heard sort of dissenting opinions among the board, will probably lean towards including the code language and then allow that to flesh itself out in a vote with the board once we move through the language itself. So we will take all of this feedback. We'll get working on drafting the actual code language itself. And I guess any questions to wrap up that process before I move on to closing us out today? Chris.
Yeah, thanks. So the slide deck with the little lightning bolts was super helpful. And I think paired with the appendices made it really easy to follow along. My question is, would it be at all possible? I know you sent out an agenda and some attachments about a week out before this meeting, and I think you might have said that there will be some kind of like regular occurrence. Would it be at all possible to get something that's kind of like equivalent to the slide deck that just has, the main discussion points ahead of time, just so that we can do a little bit of like pre-research, before the discussion. And I know that's a lot, but just, I guess it's a thought / question to put out there.
Yeah, I will be cautious in my answer because I don't want to overpromise. But I think we absolutely can work towards that. The agendas are easier to get together and get out ahead of time than the slide deck itself. But for as much as we can, I think that yes, we can try and put together that pre-material that kind of outlines what the state statute requirement is and where within our base code that we're going to look things align or things are different, so we can know where those discussion points will be. Absolutely.
And then Kim, it was dropped in the chat, and good reminder. Thank you, Carolyn. I think Rob has joined us, and I just wanted to give him an opportunity to just briefly introduce himself to everybody and if he wanted to say anything. So Rob.
Hey, sorry, I just didn't want you guys to get a full picture view of my bedroom. Rob Buchanan from Xcel Energy. I don't have, I think I've probably encountered most of you through various other committees and hearings and other whatnot, but I run our residential new construction programs for Colorado, and I am also a member of the IECC 2024 envelope subcommittee too. So that's been really exciting in its own way. But yeah, look forward to keeping continuing to build up this our code expectations, our statutory obligations. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. It's great to see you again, and it's great to have you on the board. Okay, well, with the 3 minutes that I have left, I am going to continue to commandeer your time since we've got it. And what I want to do is just give you guys a brief visual look at what the cost summary report looks like. And I want to show you guys this so you don't have questions when it gets sent to you. Our team went through each of the reports that you guys were provided and basically pulled out the summary data from each. What we found to be difficult was finding a way to pull the studies together to be sort of compared apples to apples, because in reality, none of the studies were done in an apples to apples comparison fashion. They all have different assumptions and methodologies and building types and all of that good stuff. So if you guys have any questions or feedback, or if there'd be a way to visualize this data that would be helpful beyond what we provided, we are absolutely welcome, and we welcome that feedback and are happy to put anything together. So this is our first stab at presenting the data in a way that's digestible for everyone. So each study has its own tab. The overview, each one of the studies are linked, and it kind of just provides an overview of what the report looks like. And then each report is on its own tab. And what we have up top is the methodology that was used to develop the cost study. And then, as much as possible, the very specific line by line cost impacts that were reported within each cost study. You'll see it differs, report by report. The MBI report looked at cost per square foot. If you look over at the Home Innovation Research Lab report, it actually goes through and prices out the wires and the panel capacity and all of the different pieces, and actually pulled out those costs. So they're listed as line items here. And so that's sort of how this is set up. I encourage you each to take a look within each tab. Again, apologies that there really isn't a way to combine this data without us making some grand assumptions that this number relates to a number that it truly doesn't relate to. So we're going to share this with you guys, but I wanted to just kind of show you how it's laid out and orient you to what you can find here. And then as far as our next steps, our next meeting is going to be next Wednesday, February 1st. We'll get the agenda and any pre-workout as soon as possible. Chris will try and get that the sort of breakdown of discussion points ahead to you guys as soon as possible. But please note that the format of that meeting will be very similar to this one. And we're going to be covering, I believe it's electric ready. Someone correct me if that's wrong, Adam. I'm looking. Okay, that's right. Okay. We'll be going through the electric ready code. So spend some time with that electric ready codes document that Adam put together for you guys. And we'll send out some other pieces as we develop them this week. That's all from us. Thank you guys for your time. Appreciate the 3 hours, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.